From the California freeway that pancaked during rush hour
Section of the West Grand Freeway has come down
to a brand new skyscraper crumbling in seconds. These 7 disasters share one terrifying truth. The buildings we trust most can fail without warning. Starting on October 17, 1989, when the Nimitz freeway becomes a death trap. Ruth Ann Leo Johnston just finished work. She's driving home from her office in San Francisco. Ruth crosses the Bay Bridge and takes the I-880 connector to downtown Oakland. The speedometer suddenly catches her eye. She's going incredibly fast, and she has to slow down right away. So she applies the brakes, but nothing happens. Then it clicks. She's not speeding on the freeway, but airborne in the sky. Gravity soon takes hold as her car nosedives onto the freeway's lower deck. This was the day the Cypress Street Viaduct collapsed. An earthquake with a magnitude of 6.9 struck the Bay Area and caused a large section of the freeway's upper deck to fall onto its lower deck. Although Leo Johnston lived to tell the tale, sadly, 42 others lost their lives on that faithful day. This is the story of the Cypress Street Viaduct. In 1949, the state of California designed the Nimitz Freeway, which would better connect the San Francisco Bay Area. The post-war economic boom meant that Americans had a bit more money and were increasingly selecting the private car as their transport method of choice. California has long been notorious for its traffic congestion and the lack of public transport. In the 1950s, gridlock was particularly bad in Oakland along Cypress Street, where you needed to pass to get to the Golden Gate Bridge and get into San Francisco. The many commuters from Oakland would greatly appreciate the viaduct to San Francisco. Its construction was also a way for the city to displace the people living in slums along West Oakland. The freeway would stretch along the East Bay from Oakland down to San Jose. This 2.5-kilometer stretch of motorway, linking the Nimitz Freeway with Interstate 80, was a transcontinental highway that stretched from California to New Jersey. This connector became known as the Cypress Street Viaduct and was 2 tiers high with 5 lanes per deck. The upper deck was for southbound traffic, while the lower deck was for northbound traffic. A few years after its proposal, construction began. In 1955, the off-ramp of the viaduct was built and cost approximately $1 million. In 1956, the main freeway was built by contractors Grove, Wilson, Shepard, and Kruge at $8.3 million. This company would be defunct by the time of the earthquake. Columns were put in place for every 50 feet of roadway, and steel girders were also placed beneath the surface. The lower level was about 25 feet above ground, and the road surface of the upper deck was about 38 feet above ground. It made history as California's first double-decked freeway and opened up to traffic on June 11, 1957. The viaduct looks state-of-the-art for its time, but there were a few problems. Shear keys were placed on some sections to protect against lateral loads, but not implemented across the whole viaduct, so large areas simply had no resistance to lateral forces. However, the main problem with the Cypress Street Viaduct was its location. A vast portion of the elevated highway was constructed on soft mud, with a bedrock over 490 feet below the surface. In an area highly prone to earthquakes, this was incredibly dangerous. As you may know, California is located between the Pacific and North American tectonic plates. The border between these is the San Andreas Fault, and is usually the origin of earthquakes in the region. So when it comes to them hitting California, it's not a question of if, but when. Having said that, engineers knew less about the impacts of quakes on high-rise buildings back then and used outdated methods. They believed that a solid flat surface would withstand the force. Now it's understood that it needs to be slightly bendy so that it can flex with the earthquake and not snap. Additionally, some of the columns were somewhat smaller at the base, so the weight didn't push directly down but instead pushed down at an angle. Although the freeway's location on mud was not ideal, one cannot simply pick and choose where to build a motorway. Most people don't want to live beside a busy road, and they couldn't construct a highway that was too far outside the city either. The Cypress Freeway was situated in an area that got the balance right. It didn't intrude upon the neighborhoods in Oakland, yet still was central enough to benefit people traveling to and from there. There were warning signs in 1971 when an earthquake hit the San Fernando Valley in Upper LA. It resulted in 65 deaths and more than 2,000 people injured and served as a real wake-up call. Suddenly, it was brought home that earthquakes can and will hit the Bay Area, and they needed to be prepared for it. Following the deadly 1971 San Fernando earthquake, the state of California began a two-phase program to ensure roads could withstand future natural disasters. Phase 1 involved strengthening roads with their columns, and in 1977, the state retrofitted the viaduct with cable restrainer units. Phase 2 involved strengthening the support columns. However, this was simply never carried out on this viaduct and other freeways. Instead, the state used its budget to construct new freeways and improve the appearance of existing ones. According to New Scientist, the average expenditure per year on retrofitting was $3 million, a tiny fraction of the $3 billion spent on the state's highways. By October 1989, the decision proved deadly, with the Cypress Freeway Viaduct collapse. The top deck crashed onto the bottom tier, causing some cars to be crushed down to 12 inches. Drivers on the top plummeted, and some even flew off the bridge entirely. When Leo Johnston recalled her experience flying from the top deck, she told local news outlet SF Gate, "From the corner of my eye, I saw the guardrail snap. That's when I knew this was an earthquake." Also on the freeway that day were her co-workers, Lori Marsh and Leonora Moy, who were traveling in Marsh's car. Their experience was equally as surreal. The ground was shaking, so Marsh initially thought that she had a flat tire and that her husband would be really annoyed with her. She soon complained that both tires were flat until Moy realized what was actually happening. The woman recalled, quote, "We fell about 25 feet and landed upright. We jumped out of the car, and there were people everywhere, moaning and groaning." Moy and Marsh began helping motorists and soon spotted their colleague, Leo Johnston, in the distance. They had to pull her out of the car. They noticed she was shoeless, so they went back in and rescued her now highly symbolic red heels. One blessing in disguise was a baseball game happening that day. Oakland was playing San Francisco in the World Series, so many people were indoors watching the first ever Bay Bridge World Series. The usual rush hour level of traffic was not there, and as a result, people who went home early to watch the game unintentionally missed the disaster. The game was played at Candlestick Park, a stadium that could hold over 40,000 people. 4 minutes into the game, the ground started shaking. Thankfully, they were unaffected, but the supporting screens turned black and then reappeared with news footage of what was happening. This was long before smartphones, so information was gradually traveling to the spectators on what was going on. Dennis Eckersley, who was playing for the Oakland Athletics on that day, told NBC, "I was in the bathroom combing my hair because it's almost introduction time. The bathroom is pretty close to the exit, as it turns out. I was combing my hair, and it sounded like a train was coming through the door. It was unbelievable, the screech of all the iron in the stadium. I knew what was happening. Auxiliary lights came on, and I said, 'Earthquake,' and I was out the door. I'm from the Bay Area, so I know what earthquakes are, but this was ridiculous." It was by far the worst earthquake to hit the Bay Area since 1908, which reached 7.9 on the Richter scale. This time around, the epicenter was in the Santa Cruz Mountains, on a hilltop named Loma Prieta. The Loma Prieta earthquake reached a devastating 7.1 on the Richter scale. The city of Oakland was both literally and metaphorically shaken. There were billions of dollars worth of damage, but more importantly, 64 people lost their lives. Across the city, the earthquake collapsed homes, started fires, and a small section of the Bay Area Bridge even collapsed. 2/3 of these victims were killed on the Cypress Street Viaduct, a freeway where preventative measures were ignored. Like Leo Johnston, 3,900 people suffered lifelong injuries. Emergency workers risked their lives and braved the scene, working tirelessly to rescue people from the rubble. Thankfully, there were no aftershocks, and soon even ordinary citizens were helping people climb down from the ruins with their ladders. The last survivor was rescued 90 hours after the earthquake first hit. A $300 million emergency relief fund was given to the area. The predictability of the damage is the most frustrating aspect. The soft mud the freeway was built upon primarily caused the structure to collapse. In fact, the amplitude of vibration was 5 times worse than the rest of the highway that was built on rock. According to experts on engineering.com, whereas well-graded soils help to dampen vibrations, the soft bay mud upon which most of the structure was constructed actually served to increase the amplitude of vibrations by up to 5 times in comparison to that of the rest of the freeway, which was built on rock. This means not only did the soft mud fail to withstand the vibrations, but it also managed to make the vibrations even worse. Additionally, the angular frequency, the rate at which an object moves through a given angle, was a problem. As it happens, the angular frequency of the seismic waves of Loma Prieta almost had the same frequency as the individual horizontal sections. And, as I said earlier, shear keys were not fastened to secure the upper deck with the lower deck, except in some sections. In the aftermath, the California Department of Transportation's then chief engineer, William E. Schaefer, repeatedly said that no such technology existed to prevent this tragedy. However, an engineer who worked under Schaefer and wished to remain anonymous told the LA Times shortly after that the technology had been around since San Fernando, but was not used because of budget limitations and priority considerations. It would cost $100,000 a column to strengthen the Nimitz freeway, and the roadway has more than 100 columns. Some engineers speculate that the steel reinforcing plates could have been retrofitted to the existing columns, and lead or rubber isolators would have minimized the vibrations. Both of those technologies existed at the time of the earthquake. At the same time, they also argue that rebuilding the viaduct would have been a Herculean task and needed to be completely redesigned, from the soil conditions to the pin joints. While technical details were definitely responsible, it does raise the question of why this 2-tiered viaduct that soared over 30 feet into the sky in an earthquake-prone area was built in the first place. At what point do the benefits of the alleviation of traffic in Oakland outweigh the possible dangers it presents to its citizens? To be fair, although the disaster may have been predictable, it was also improbable given that it was the strongest earthquake to hit the area. Those before had not reached such a high magnitude. Also, when investigating the rubble, it was found that many components were structurally sound. Some of the concrete sampled was more than satisfactory and was cast according to the procedures at the time of the earthquake. Maybe it was a case of extreme conditions causing extreme damages? After all, there is only so much you can do to prevent an act of God. The collapse of this freeway served as yet another wake-up call that couldn't be ignored this time around. In response, $64 million was allocated to retrofit 767 bridges throughout California. But for many, it was too little, too late. The destruction during the collapse was so devastating that it wasn't a case of rebuilding the viaduct, but starting from scratch. In 1997, a single-level viaduct which stood mainly at ground level was built as its replacement. This cost $1.2 billion, making it the most expensive state project in U.S. history at the time. There was, quite understandably, massive public disapproval of simply building it on the same site. Instead, they built the new connecting roads across an old railway line, and purchasing this land from Amtrak proved incredibly expensive. The new Cypress Freeway arcs sharply north and west of the old structure. I've spent 2 weeks learning how a freeway collapses, but I still haven't figured out what's for dinner. Luckily, Cook Unity has that sorted. So, let's try. Cook Unity makes it easy to eat well at home by delivering delicious chef-crafted meals right to your door, ready to eat in 2 minutes. No more cereal for dinner because you ran out of time. Instead, there's truffled fettuccine alfredo with grilled chicken, chili lime tacos, and 300 other restaurant-quality dishes for you to choose from, all designed by actual award-winning chefs. I love Cook Unity because it means I can stick to eating real, genuinely good food without having to clear my entire evening to make it happen. That's more time for the things I actually care about: running, football, and collapsing freeways. So, whether you're trying to eat healthier, make more time for the things you care about, or just take all that work out of dinner, use my link to subscribe to Cook Unity and get 50% off your first week. Up next, a supermarket in Latvia, where the cause of the collapse is as outrageous as the collapse itself. When profit comes before safety, disaster is inevitable. Unfortunately, it is usually innocent people who suffer the most. Thursday, November 21st, 2013, is yet another working day in the North European country of Latvia. At around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, most people head home. A common stop is the Maxima shopping center in the western suburbs of Riga. It houses one of the newest and largest supermarkets and is known for one peculiar occurrence. Now and then, a false fire alarm rings out in the store. During construction, a faulty system was installed and is causing disturbances for the tenants. Today, it sounds once again at 4:21 p.m. Already accustomed to the howling sound, supermarket staff pays little attention to it, a feeling customers share as well. For security reasons, one of the employees goes down to the basement to check it out, and as many times before, it turns out it was a false alarm. Even though there is no fire threat in sight, danger lurks above everyone's heads. 1 hour and 20 minutes after the alarm, the roof caves in on the crowded store. It is peak shopping hour, the worst possible time for a disaster. The roof collapse killed 51 people and injured 41 more. The fire alarm that everyone ignored turned out to be the precursor of the tragedy. 2 years before, in 2011, the opening ceremony of the Maxima shopping center celebrated a new era in the city's urban planning. The building was presented as a new design concept, striving beyond the usual decorated box shape. It consisted of a 51,100 square foot shopping area, of which the supermarket occupied most. In the autumn of 2013, work on adapting the shopping center's roof started, which included a green area and playground. At the same time, an underground garage for the residents was being built. The works were carried out by the same construction company, Riga. During construction, the Maxima Center operated full-time. As customers swarmed through the center, builders worked unnoticed above their heads and below their feet. There was no reason to believe that the building could collapse at any moment. Before the false fire alarms became common at the center, there was a case when a fire broke out and endangered the entire project. Several months before the grand opening, a blaze started in the supermarket. Luckily, the incident ended without casualties, and even though the fire made noticeable damage to the building, engineers claim there was no structural impact. It was the first and last time an incident of such scale happened at the Maxima Center. For the next 2 years, false fire alarms sounded countless times, but there was never even a spark. Over time, everyone got used to it, and it became a trademark of the center. Nevertheless, the guard had to follow the procedure that called for the alarm to be checked before an evacuation order was given. Only a group of construction workers were engaged in building the garage. There was no trace of a fire. The Maxima staff later stated during the investigation that they always believed the dust from the construction works was activating the fire alarm, which was a possibility. Once the guard determined the alarm was false, he reported the case to the fire protection operator. The shoppers in the supermarket were informed there was no fire. The store would continue to operate as usual. It was 5:41 p.m., 1 hour and 20 minutes after the alarm, when the sound of background music and the shopping carts was interrupted by a loud bang. A large portion of the roof smashed down with all its weight. As later claimed by the survivors, there was no indications of the ceiling cracking or anything else to warn them of the incoming collapse. Everything happened within seconds. Those inside the supermarket had no chance of escaping. Outside the center, a massive cloud of dust mixed with glass shards burst through the front colonnade, sending the people out in front into a panic. The roof's collapse made it look as if an explosion had gone off inside. Only once the dust cloud settled did the disaster's scope become obvious. More than half of the roof was missing. Its sidewalls, the front colonnade, and the residential building were still standing. While the people outside were screaming in horror, inside the center, a strange, deadly silence reigned. The pile of steel and concrete covered most of the supermarket and everyone inside it. Just 5 minutes after the roof collapsed, Riga's State Fire and Rescue Service Department received an emergency call. The roof of the shopping center at 20 Predane Street in the neighborhood of Zolitude collapsed and buried dozens of people. 7 fire engines rushed toward the disaster site. Under several tons of rubble, an unknown number of people were buried. Some roof structures were so large they could only be moved by special machinery. The scale of the tragedy called for more workforce. By 7 p.m., 100 firefighters and 18 fire engines were thrown into action to save the survivors from the shopping center ruins. The firefighters were organized into 4 teams, each led by a responsible officer. The job they were tasked with wouldn't be easy. The firefighters were worried that the roof could collapse if they didn't find survivors quickly, and they were right. With the rescue operation in full swing, at 7:04 p.m., a part of the still-standing roof above one of the rescue workstations gave way. The construction collapsed suddenly, in the same manner as before. Again, there were no warning signs. What's more, the firefighters inspected the load-bearing structures before setting up the site and found no visual defects. 3 firefighters were killed in the second collapse. However, the tragedy didn't stop their colleagues from continuing the rescue operation. By the end of the day, 92 more firefighters were engaged in the rescue operation, as well as 100 soldiers of the Latvian army. Powerful cranes were brought in for the removal of heavy chunks of concrete. In addition, the Latvian State Police and the State Border Guard arrived with search dogs to help locate the survivors. They worked tirelessly through the night to rescue as many victims as possible. It turned out that the operation was more complex than everyone envisioned. The scent of spilled alcohol and household chemicals from the supermarket impeded the dogs from locating the people. So, instead of dogs, the firefighters started using thermal cameras to find the trapped shoppers by detecting their body heat. Unfortunately, the attempt quickly hit an obstacle, as thermal imaging was impossible to scan under areas of more than 8 inches of concrete. For 2 whole days, the rescue team struggled to locate and excavate victims. Sadly, there were more bodies to recover than survivors to rescue. As crews went deeper into the ruins, almost all recovered victims had sustained severe injuries, meaning the chances of finding more survivors were close to none. On November 23rd, 2 days later, another part of the roof collapsed. The rescue operation was then called off. After 48 hours of searching, all workstations were removed from the site. As the rubble was cleared, no new bodies were found. The final death toll of 51 people was made up of customers, employees, and 3 firefighters. 41 people sustained injuries, many in critical condition. Among the injured was the security guard who had reported the false fire alarm before the disaster. Now that the rescue crew and recovery operation was over, it was time to see if the alarm had anything to do with the collapse. The truth was about to be revealed. On the day of the disaster, the police had already begun investigating the cause. They based their case on a suspicion that state construction regulations were violated and that the building was not built to code. The way the roof had fallen during the rescue operation hinted that poor roof-carrying construction could have caused the collapse. The investigators also wanted to discover why people were not evacuated after the alarm sounded. The entire nation was stunned by a tragedy, the largest one since the country regained its independence in 1991. The Latvian president, Andris Bērziņš, called the tragedy a murder and promised that the authorities would get to the bottom of it. He insisted that all involved in the construction became subjects of investigation. Everyone was to be questioned, the architects who designed the building and the contractors who built it, to the city authorities and responsible supervision bodies. The police assembled a team of leading construction experts to assist. Based on the initial inspection of the site, they drew up 3 possible scenarios. Firstly, there was a suspicion of violations of architectural design and construction supervision standards. Second, the shopping center's construction regulations might have been violated during its first construction phase. Thirdly, the recent upgrades to the building caused the disaster. Due to the risk of further collapse, the investigation began in April 2014, months after the disaster took place. Only once the remaining construction was reinforced were investigators allowed to enter the ruins of the Maxima Center. They conducted a series of controlled collapses of the roof remnants and several controlled fires. The goal was to see if the 2011 fire could have weakened the building structure and if the construction was strong enough to hold the roof. During the tests, inspectors noticed one peculiar thing. The steel support structures deformed well before the target weight stress was reached. That meant only one thing: the load-bearing structure was not built properly. With the insight into official records provided by all parties involved in building the shopping center, the investigators revealed the chain of events that led to the disaster. In late 2009, the architectural firm Cubs submitted the building design for implementation. The construction project was led by structural engineer Ivar Sergets. The construction board accepted the concept and Sergets drafted the drawing for the building. He closely followed the architect's idea, but made one slight yet significant modification. Instead of single-piece steel trusses, Sergets replaced each with 2 shorter ones for easier transportation. He failed to see that, in this manner, he significantly reduced the load-bearing capacity of the construction. The weight of the roof was held by the trusses, but only by the joints between them. Additionally, a more detailed inspection revealed an improper arrangement of the bolts on joints, and it turned out the bolts used were not even designed for joining trusses for the roof. The structure held for 2 years, but when construction of the garden began, the load capacity increased, and joints holding the trusses ultimately gave in. In support of the scenario, the security video that captured the incident showed the roof collapsed exactly at these points. Astonishingly, nobody in the chain of construction and supervision noticed the serious structural mistake. The investigators were eager to know if the oversight was made on purpose. They were right. This is what they discovered. On February 28, 2011, 4 people signed the Construction Acceptance Act, a vital piece of construction documentation. Without one, the building of the shopping center would never have been started. The act was signed by Riga's manager, construction supervisor, construction engineer Ivar Sergets, and Andreas Kushovs from Vicom, the subcontractor that built the trusses. Shockingly, it was later discovered that the owner of another subcontractor that assembled the trusses forged Andres Kushev's signature to avoid hiring a civil engineer. This cost-cutting and violation of construction regulations cost 51 people their lives. Several years before the disaster, due to a shortage of funds, the government shut down the state construction inspection, handing the duty over to local governments. Unfortunately, not long after, for the same reasons, the Riga City Council eliminated the local construction supervision department. This meant that when the Maxima shopping center construction started in 2011, there was no official body to supervise it. It is believed that the local government made the decision not only for cost-cutting reasons, but also to facilitate the numerous construction projects implemented in Riga. The country was recovering from the 2008 financial crisis, and the construction industry was important in that process. However, the lack of supervision created chaos. After the disaster, the Riga Construction Board inspected more than 200 public buildings and found certain problems in 31 of them. The only one to resign in response to public resentment was Prime Minister Dombrovskis. The government intended to show the nation that it would improve. A series of laws and subordinate regulations were brought to regulate the organization of construction works and the responsibility of those who conduct them. Meanwhile, for a year and a half, the investigators gathered evidence to build an indictment against those responsible for the Zolitude tragedy. Finally, on December 8, 2015, the 9 accused were brought to trial. Construction engineer Ivar Sergets, architect Andris Kalinka, 2 construction inspectors, the head of construction at the Re&Re, 3 representatives of the Riga Construction Board, and an employee of the Maxima supermarket in charge of the safety procedures. After 2 months, the court delivered only one guilty verdict to Ivar Sergets for making, quote, gross errors in the structural calculations, which directly led to the collapse. For violating construction regulations and manslaughter due to negligence, Ivar Sergets was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The other defendants were acquitted of all charges. To support victims of the tragedy and their relatives, the state and city of Riga allocated more than 1.7 million euros. A charity organization provided a further 1.17 million euros. Finally, the Maxima Latvia chain of supermarkets allocated around 8 million euros. Next up is a collapse measured not in minutes, but in seconds. Beneath a sprawling glass dome, the Transvaal water park promises families and thrill seekers an aquatic paradise. But without warning, the laughter of children and the splashes of swimmers turned to chilling screams as the sky above them came crashing down. How did this ordinary Saturday outing take such a terrifying turn? Why could a newly built structure fail so catastrophically? And who was responsible for the lives lost in the disaster? Transvaal Park in Moscow's southern Yasenevo district was a massive 217,000 square foot behemoth of a building. Its glass-paneled dome-shaped roof was an architectural feat and symbolized the growth of entrepreneurship in post-Soviet Russia. The park had an African theme, featuring numerous spacious heated pools, including a thrilling wave pool and a winding river, perfect for tubing. It housed a 12-lane bowling alley, saunas, a gym, a beauty salon, restaurants, and bars. The attraction was temperature-controlled and could easily accommodate up to 2,000 visitors at a time. During the harsh Russian winters, park-goers could tan in solariums, while the outside temperatures could drop to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. But the complex would suffer a devastating blow not even 2 years after opening its doors. On Saturday, the 14th of February 2004, with temperatures at just 0 degrees Fahrenheit, more than 1,300 tickets were sold as locals sought refuge from the winter climate. It wasn't a cheap activity either, with ticket prices costing in the region of 940 rubles, approximately $33 at the time. It was a hive of activity with people swimming, a kiddie's birthday party being celebrated at the pool, and a Valentine's Day dance for teenagers. But as visitors enjoyed the balmy indoor complex, a loud crack reverberated throughout, followed by a few moments of deathly silence. The collapse was like a thunderous avalanche, with the main center support beam giving way first. Composed primarily of glass and concrete, the collapse unleashed a deadly downpour of razor-sharp shards and massive concrete chunks on around 350 bathers below. The collapse was over in just 30 to 40 seconds. Panic crowds dressed in swimwear started running outside for safety, where the frosty temperature was well below 5 degrees Fahrenheit. All that remained of the once grand roof was a gaping chasm about the size of a football field. Over 53,000 square feet of the overhead structure had collapsed, burying a playground, a kiddie swimming pool, and water slides. Hundreds had narrowly escaped death by running out into the icy temperatures, but many were not so lucky. Frantic survivors were desperately trying to dig their way out of the rubble, while others were anxiously calling out to loved ones, seen only seconds before the collapse. Within minutes, emergency services mobilized in force. Over 800 first responders rushed bloody people clad in bikinis and swimming trunks on stretchers to ambulances. Medics were contending not only with injuries incurred during the collapse, but also with incidents of exposure-related symptoms. Preventing frostbite among the survivors amid the plunging temperatures became critical. 2 hours after the roof caved in, the complex was evacuated, and all those injured were taken to nearby hospitals. But the search for trapped people remained ongoing. With temperatures outside at around 5 degrees Fahrenheit, rescuers used heat guns and generators to pump warm air into the building to increase the chances of survival for those trapped under the rubble. K-9 units were brought in to aid in the search for survivors. Emergency personnel searched through the night, periodically calling for silence to listen for signs of life. But by the early hours of Sunday morning, none were heard, and the search for survivors was called off later that day. The last person rescued from the rubble alive was at 3 a.m. 106 people were recovered from the rubble alive, while more than 140 people were injured. Dozens of bodies had been recovered, but the true extent of the death toll would only emerge later. But what could have led to the catastrophic failure of a complex that was barely 2 years old? Early reports indicated that the roof collapse was a result of an explosion. The city had been on edge since a deadly subway blast just days before the tragedy. The acclaimed architect of the complex, Nodar Cancelli, believed the roof caved in due to outside influence, like a bombing, instead of design flaws. The architect said he had seen surveillance footage showing a cloud of dust several feet in length erupting from the side of the column before the roof collapsed. Those claims would, however, not bode well for the aquatic park's new owners, Inteco. It was one of Moscow's largest construction firms, owned by Yelena Baturina, the billionaire wife of the city's mayor. The entertainment complex was insured against all accidents, but the policy did not cover an act of terrorism. In any event, officials quickly distanced themselves from such claims, saying there was no evidence of a bomb blast. Subsequent investigations from experts would also later find no traces of explosives in the ruins of the building. Russian authorities therefore focused on possible technical flaws in the design of the building. The mammoth task of finding out what caused the collapse fell to 3 state entities, who jumped into action on the day of the incident, opening a criminal investigation. The authorities were contemplating charges of negligent manslaughter, which, if proven, could lead to a maximum prison sentence of 5 years. Several architectural experts, meanwhile, condemned the Moscow mayor, who commissioned the building, for the disaster. Mayor Luzhkov reportedly announced a plan in 2002 to build water parks throughout Moscow, although there were no safety controls to construct these projects. Many in the engineering fraternity blamed a culture of corruption prevalent in all local construction sites at the time. The economic boom of the period had reportedly led to several hastily constructed sites that were structurally unsound. Over the next 20 months, more than 200 specialized tests were conducted, including forensic, explosives, and metallurgical tests to single out the cause. The complex was designed by a Russian firm, Kiselev & Partners, with Nodar Cancelli as the chief designer, while a Turkish company, Koçak, built it. The unique water park, with its eye-catching dome, was initially designed using steel or aluminum columns, but it was ultimately constructed with a reinforced concrete dome, which was much cheaper than a metal one. Both builders had impeccable reputations before the collapse. They were responsible for some of the most eye-catching buildings in Russia, including President Putin's residence in the Kremlin. Obtaining approval to construct the massive Transvaal water park required permission from many government departments. Industry experts said that such a colossal undertaking would have needed signing off from at least 120 officials at all local levels. But despite this multi-layered review process, the 5-story park was built in just 18 months. The rapid construction of such a sizable facility in less than 2 years prompted concerns about whether due diligence was done. Investigators explored multiple theories regarding the collapse. This included snow accumulation, temperature differences between indoor and outdoor areas, and water seepage into the concrete supports. The snow theory was the first to be put to bed, as aquapark employees indicated they cleared snow on the domed roof daily. Water park management defended the construction quality despite reports of poor workmanship. According to a spokesperson for the company, they had received documents guaranteeing the building's integrity for 100 years, obtained a year before the incident. Furthermore, the companies involved in building the complex said that Transvaal Park's glass and concrete dome and its concrete supports were guaranteed to operate reliably for 10 years before needing any repairs. However, according to the reports, this was simply not the case. Employees at Transvaal Park reported observing numerous cracks in the load-bearing structures, suggesting an alternate theory that the collapse could be attributed to operational failures. According to Russian media, the park's owners had received recommendations to cut the operating costs of the expensive complex to start making a profit. Cancelli reportedly worked on Transvaal Park's unique dome structure purely out of scientific interest, receiving just $20,000 for the project. However, problems emerged as calculations for the engineering of the domed complex could not be independently verified because there was no similar project to compare it to. Designers originally planned to support the domed roof with aluminum structures. However, these were replaced with much cheaper reinforced concrete supports during construction. According to the investigation report, the decision to make this change was made by Cancelli's firm. It's believed the use of cheaper concrete in place of the intended aluminum likely compromised the roof's structural integrity and contributed to its collapse. After an extensive 20-month investigation, Cancelli and Antoli Voronin, head of the state agency that signed off on the building plans, were found to be responsible for the tragedy. Cancelli consistently denied any guilt, but the report found that the architect had selected the wrong type of concrete. Cancelli reportedly opted for unstressed or regular concrete instead of stronger reinforced concrete. This was likely done to avoid redesigning the entire structure, but it left the roof vulnerable to high stresses. Additionally, the domed roof design became unstable when winds blew. Its shape caused excess movement that regular concrete could not withstand. By failing to use reinforced concrete and not accounting for the additional stress from the roof's shape, Cancelli dangerously compromised the integrity of the critical load-bearing structure. Structural analysis also showed the roof was overloaded, carrying 29% more weight than its design limits. After releasing their conclusive findings, Moscow prosecutors signed an indictment in December 2005, ready to take the criminal case in Cancelli to court. Cancelli, who was 68 years old at the time, had his lawyers petition prosecutors to conclude the Transvaal Park's criminal probe, citing his client's advanced age as the reason. In May 2006, prosecutors agreed to close their investigation into Cancelli under a parliamentary amnesty. The case against Voronin, who signed off the building plans, was ultimately dismissed due to a lack of substantive evidence. The news came as a blow to the friends and family of the 28 people, including 8 children who died in the tragedy. Only 14 civil suits were subsequently filed by victims seeking compensation. Sadly, less than half of them would receive any settlements. In the aftermath of the Transvaal Park tragedy, justice remained elusive for those who lost their lives. Despite findings pointing to design flaws and negligence, the architect responsible continued to shape Moscow's skyline. His legacy was forever entwined with controversy until his passing in 2015. Today, an even bigger complex, Morandi Water Park, now stands on the site where 28 people lost their lives due to negligence and corruption. Transvaal gave no warning. The next one was decades in the making. Ferragosto, the day when Italy stops. On this public holiday, Italians take a rest from their work and everyday routine. It's August 14th, 2018, the day before the holiday, and the weather is all but sunny in Genoa. A torrential rainstorm hits the city, but the locals don't let the superstorm stop them from heading toward the beautiful holiday centers along the coast of the Ligurian Sea. The Morandi Bridge is bustling with traffic. It carries the A10 motorway, the transport artery of the northern Italian Riviera that also links Italy with France. Thousands of passengers are crossing the bridge. One of them is truck driver Luigi Fiorio in his blue and green Volvo FM300. It's raining cats and dogs, but Fiorio has a delivery to make. A bolt of lightning strikes one of the bridge towers as he approaches it. Seconds later, through the heavy mist of rain, Fiorio notices a vehicle disappearing through the asphalt. Suddenly, he realizes the bridge is collapsing in front of him. He pushes the brakes as hard as he can and nails his truck just a few yards away from the abyss. Luigi stands on the verge of death, but manages to run away from his vehicle. He runs and doesn't look back, not until he reaches solid ground. While the rain pours on him, he sees the bridge and is overcome with disbelief, realizing what a disaster he survived. The Morandi Bridge was one of Genoa's landmarks, popularly known as the Brooklyn Bridge. The multi-span cable-stayed bridge vaguely resembled the famous construction in New York. It had a length of 3,878 feet, crossing the Polcevera River Valley at the height of 148 feet. The bridge was supported by reinforced concrete piers and 3 inverted V-shaped 300-foot-tall pylons. Each tower supported 4 cable stays stretching to both sides of the bridge's deck. The Polcevera Viaduct, as it was called officially, was built in 1960, the golden age of the Italian economy, to bypass the traffic-congested downtown Genoa. Better connectivity became necessary as the country's trade and living standards increased. Italians began building motorways. Genoa became a crossroads connecting the Ligurian Riviera with southern France and the northern Italian cities of Turin and Milan. The bridge, which was actually a viaduct, was designed by the famous Italian engineer Riccardo Morandi, after whom it was named. It took 4 years to build, from 1963 to 1967, when Italian President Giuseppe Saragat inaugurated it. The Morandi Bridge was yet another of the engineer's successful accomplishments after he became famous for building the General Rafael Urdaneta Bridge in Venezuela. Despite being much longer, the Venezuelan bridge was similar in its basic design. They were both cable-stayed bridges built using reinforced and pre-stressed concrete. Riccardo Morandi was the pioneer of using pre-stressed concrete in engineering. As the word itself says, this type of concrete is being stressed during production. Namely, high-strength tendons within the concrete volume are being tensioned before the concrete solidifies. Once the concrete becomes solid, the tendons are released, thus applying compressive stress to the concrete structure. In this manner, the stress of the tendons counteracts the compression forces of the load applied to the concrete structure. Compared to reinforced concrete structures, pre-stressed concrete is much stronger. Engineers use it to build strong constructions with less structural thickness and fewer supporting elements. It goes without saying that this technique saves money. For this reason, the pre-stressed concrete greatly benefited the rising Italian post-war economy. While the industry lacked steel to build with, the country was abundant in concrete-making materials. Morandi became the construction guru, and his technique became a symbol of Italian architecture, applied by engineers across the country. Thousands of viaducts, bridges, tunnels, and other construction were built using pre-stressed concrete. One of them was the Morandi Bridge in Genoa. The deck and most of the structure was made of reinforced concrete. However, pre-stressed concrete was used for the cable stays, which was quite unusual at the time. Most suspended bridges had steel cable stays, but the Morandi Bridge had them housed inside the pre-stressed concrete box, thus reducing the use of steel in its construction. It allowed the designer to achieve a distinctive, slender design. Each cable stay was capable of carrying 33,000 pounds of weight, which allowed large spans between pylons. Morandi was proud of the work he had done, as was the public. The press stated the bridge's concrete structure won't need any maintenance, neither will its stayed cables, which are protected from atmospheric agents by their concrete vest. Indeed, the bridge would carry heavy loads over time. The traffic increased with each year, reaching over 25 million transits annually. The summer holiday brings tourists to the Ligurian Riviera, which naturally increases traffic. On Tuesday, August 14, 2018, it was a busy day at the bridge as expected. Nothing unusual, one might say. Then, all of a sudden, at 11:36 a.m., the deck on both sides of pylon number 9 collapsed at points where it connected the stays. Like a house of cards, it was followed by the deck in between, the stays, and ultimately the entire tower fell. It all happened so quickly that drivers crossing the bridge had no time to react. At the moment of the collapse, a car traveling westwards flew into the air before the collapsing pylon took it down. A truck driving in the opposite lane fell down as the deck under its wheels collapsed. Luigi Fiorio's blue and green Volvo FM300 stopped just a few feet before the edge of the collapsed bridge. It later became a symbol of the disaster. Between 30 and 35 cars and 3 heavy vehicles fell from the bridge. The drivers on both sides of the collapse halted their vehicles and began to flee, fearing that the rest of the bridge would follow suit. In the end, only a part of 650 feet in length held by the 9th pylon cable stays collapsed. It fell on the Polcevera riverbed, railway tracks, and some of the structures landed on warehouses belonging to a power engineering company. Luckily, the facility was almost empty due to the upcoming holiday. The collapse produced a thunderous sound, deceiving the nearby building's residents into believing an earthquake had occurred. But to their surprise, they saw that an entire section of the bridge was missing. A heap of concrete was all that was left. The accident raised the alarm throughout the city. Medics and firefighters from all hospitals and stations raced to the scene. There was little they could do, however, as chunks of the bridge were too heavy to be lifted without special machinery. To make matters worse, heavy rain kept falling. The news of the disaster spread quickly. Over 250 firefighters from across Italy gathered at the scene to help recover the people trapped underneath the rubble. They had to use climbing equipment and sniffer dogs to find survivors and locate victims. Rescue workers carefully searched for survivors for 2 days, clearing the pile piece by piece. Although time was of the essence for those trapped beneath tons of concrete, speeding up the clearing process would only have made matters worse. After the collapse, large chunks of concrete created pockets in which people were trapped. Sudden movement of these parts risked collapsing the pockets. When rescuers located survivors, they carefully removed layers of debris on top of them using heavy cranes. More than 400 residents from the buildings underneath the bridge were evacuated due to fears that other parts of the bridge might collapse. The railway traffic was also suspended for the same reason. The disaster was terrifying. The fact that 16 people survived was deemed a miracle. A driver whose car fell off the bridge escaped without a scratch. Even though it toppled from the height of 148 feet along with tons of concrete, the car didn't smash. The driver walked away unharmed. Unfortunately, 43 other people didn't survive the collapse. Their bodies were recovered and taken to a hospital for identification. 18 of them were buried in a state funeral on August 18th. Italy was shocked at news that the Morandi Bridge had collapsed out of the blue. The experts, however, weren't as surprised. They knew the collapse was inevitable. Morandi Bridge suffered from serious structural problems, one of which surfaced in the very first year after its completion. It became clear that engineers miscalculated the creep of concrete. As a result, concrete undulated in all 3 dimensions, resulting in a bumpy deck. The problem was finally fixed in the mid-1980s after a series of structural repairs. Another problem was the aging of the bridge. During the construction, pre-stressed concrete elements were exposed to compressive pressure of only 10 megapascals, making them susceptible to premature cracks. Generally, 32 megapascals are considered high-strength concrete and are used to construct structural elements such as bridges. It allowed water to intrude and cause corrosion of steel elements inside. Even Morandi was surprised at how fast his bridge was deteriorating. In 1979, he compiled a detailed report on the condition of the bridge, recommending the authorities remove all traces of rust on the exposure of the reinforcements, fill the patches with epoxy resin, and cover everything with elastomer of very high chemical resistance. This would then prevent further corrosion and deterioration of the structure. Despite all the improvements and redesigns, the bridge continued to deteriorate at a fast pace. In the 1990s, the condition of the cable stays was alarming. About 30% of the stays on pylon number 11 had corroded away, reducing the load per stay by half. The company that maintained the bridge, Autostrade S.p.A., was forced to make serious improvements to the structure. Stays at pylon 11 were reinforced using external steel cables. On pylon number 10, stays were strengthened with steel sheathing at the top. However, the 9th pylon had no reinforcements installed. As years passed, the bridge's condition didn't improve and began causing concerns. In 2016, 2 years before the disaster, Antonio Brencic, an expert in reinforced concrete construction and professor at the University of Genoa, pointed out what other experts had been claiming for years. The Morandi Bridge was a failure of engineering and needed to be replaced. By that time, the cost of the improvements made on the bridge surpassed the eventual cost of tearing it down and building a new one. That same year, Senator Maurizio Rossi filed a question to the Ministry of Infrastructure on the condition of the road network in Genoa. Senator Rossi claimed, "The bridge has been the subject of a worrying failure of the joints which made it necessary to carry out an extraordinary maintenance work without which there is a real risk of its closure," and asked that the Morandi Bridge should have been closed to heavy traffic. In October 2017, Professor Carmelo Gentile of the prestigious Politecnico di Milano conducted specific measurements of the acoustic properties of the bridge's structure. In Professor Gentile's report, significant anomalies were noted in the stays of pylon 9. For that reason, he suggested installing a monitoring system in order to take timely measurements before something serious happened. But unfortunately, neither Autostrade management nor the authorities paid attention to the report. In April 2018, the Autostrade company finally decided to upgrade the bridge structure with an accent on 9 and 10 pylons. A tender was issued for $21.4 million. Work was scheduled to begin in autumn of 2018, roughly 6 months later, and last for 5 years. Before the work began, Autostrade workers upgraded safety by installing concrete jersey barriers. The result was an increased load on the already weakened bridge. On August 14th, the bridge structure finally gave in. According to the report by the commission formed by the Ministry of Infrastructure published in September 2018, the cause of the collapse was not the breakage of stays, but of other structural elements like edge beams of buffer decks or caisson decks conditioned by advanced corrosion. The commission also noted that the lack of care during the bridge's construction contributed to its collapse. In the end, the report blamed Autostrade's management for underestimating the unequivocal warning signal, minimizing or concealing the seriousness of the situation to the Ministry of Infrastructure, and not adopting any precautionary measures to protect users. Clearly, the company in charge of maintaining the bridge was aware of all the deficiencies, but was reluctant to spend funds on repairing it. Unfortunately, 43 lives had to be lost for those responsible to take action. Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte visited Genoa to inspect the disaster site personally. During a cabinet meeting he held in the city, a decision was made to declare a state of emergency for 12 months in Liguria and release €5 million to help with immediate needs. The government was about to regain control over the Autostrade company, which was privatized, in charge of infrastructure. As for the bridge, the government decided there would be no further improvements. It was to be demolished and replaced with a new bridge. On June 28, 2019, the remaining pylons number 10 and 11 were razed to the ground with a ton of explosives. 3 days earlier, construction on a replacement bridge, the Genoa St. George Bridge, began. The inauguration of the new bridge over the Polcevera Valley took place on August 3, 2020. Ferragosto 2018 was indeed the day when the whole of Italy stopped. but to mourn the compatriots who lost lives in an engineering disaster that could have been easily avoided. Up next, the most personal collapse on the list, hitting people right in their homes. A thundering noise awakens the residents of Surfside, Florida. It is as if an earthquake shook the town. The noise comes from one particular place, the Champlain Towers South. At the beachfront condominium, a massive cloud of dust rises in the air. Upon settling down, it reveals an awful truth. The 12-story building has collapsed in one of the worst construction disasters in U.S. history. The charming small town near Miami is the city's uptown beach community and home to some of the area's most lavish resorts. Restaurants, coffee shops, and parks provide its residents with an urban feel, while at the same time, long sandy beaches give the impression of a true vacation haven. At Collins Avenue, just steps away from the beach, is Champlain Towers South, a 12-story beachfront condominium with stunning ocean views. Its residents are considered lucky to own a property here, but in reality, their dream home is nowhere near as perfect as they believe. On June 24, 2021, they will learn why. 98 people lose their lives in a split second. But the disaster has been developing for decades, right under their feet. Just a few minutes before the collapse, a couple was enjoying a warm night in the hotel next to Champlain Towers South. As they later recalled, they noticed something strange at the garage entrance. There was a pile of concrete rubble on the floor, with water pouring in streams from the ceiling. The Champlain Towers condo had its own pool, and it seemed like water was leaking into the garage. It was a prelude to the disaster. Around 1:22 a.m., the concrete beams on the garage ceiling broke, and the pool deck caved in. A loud noise woke up residents whose condo faced the pool deck. The entire deck collapsed on cars parked in the garage. It was an image that instantly threw them into a panic. Seconds after, disaster would strike them. After the pool deck caved in, the adjacent central part broke off from the rest of the building and crashed down. From a distance, the collapse looked like a controlled explosion as stories melted into one another. It was what the experts call a pancake collapse. The cut-off northeast corner of the building stood for a few more seconds before it too gave way. The entire event lasted less than 12 seconds. A vast cloud of dust and deadly silence spread over the neighborhood. Once the dust settled, it revealed a hair-raising situation. The western portion of Champlain Towers South was still standing. In its northern part, where it connected to the central section, were the exposed remains of destroyed condos. It looked as if someone had ripped off a piece of the building. In one of the apartments on the top floor, a children's bunk bed stood just inches from the abyss. Beneath was a 3-story high pile of iron and concrete, with numerous people buried beneath it. Just 1 minute after the collapse, the local fire brigade received the first emergency call. Upon arriving on scene, first responders were shocked to see a war zone-like situation.
Rescues on their way. This is huge. I mean, humongous.
The central section was completely destroyed. People were rushing from the still-standing part of the building. From beneath the rubble, voices rang out, screaming for help.
Is anybody there? Is anybody down there injured? There's a lot of dust. I can barely see anything.
It was astonishing to see some residents emerge from the ruins as they managed to find their way out of the blocked part of the building. Those trapped on the upper floors yelled to attract the rescuers' attention. At first glance, it was clear that a massive tragedy had struck Surfside, one that required the entire effort of Miami-Dade County. Hundreds of firefighters and police officers arrived as sirens ripped through the night air. By 4 a.m., the rescue operation was in full swing. Special teams with search dogs were engaged while powerful air jacks were brought in to deal with the heavy concrete blocks. Among the first residents to be rescued were teenager Jonah Handler and his mom, Stacy Dawn Feng. The two were trapped beneath a 9,500-pound concrete slab that had formed a cave. Crouched and holding hands, they waited for the rescuers to find them. Luckily, a passerby walking his dog saw Jonah's fingers reaching through the wreckage and called for help. Dozens of firefighters bolted to take the kid and parent out. It was a risky venture, as they had to move the massive slab with an air jack on unstable ground. One wrong move, and both would have been crushed by the concrete. By good fortune, about an hour after the collapse, Jonah was taken out from the ruins and driven to the hospital to be taken care of. However, rescuing his mom took more effort and time, as she was trapped deeper than her son. Eventually, she was rescued and taken to the hospital, but sadly, she passed away. Firefighters rescued 35 residents, most of whom were trapped in still standing parts of the building. However, 159 residents were still missing. Both the county mayor and the governor of Florida issued a state of emergency to mobilize as many resources as possible for the rescue operation. A reunification center for families was formed at the Surfside Community Center. People were pouring in looking for lost friends and relatives. Following the disaster, a number of specialized rescue teams were brought into the scene, including the FEMA Urban Search and Rescue Task Force teams, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and even a foreign unit from the Israeli Defense Forces Homefront Command. The operation lasted for days. Rescue teams worked relentlessly, 12-hour shifts, 24 hours per day. To add to the complications, work on the ruins was hindered by an underground fire that filled the cavities inside the wreck with smoke. With each day, the number of missing was gradually decreasing, but with no survivors among them. On July 1st, after a week of superhuman effort to rescue the trapped residents, there were 18 dead and 143 people missing. As the time was running out, the rescue operation suddenly had to be called off. Rescuer safety was threatened by the western wing of the building that was still standing and dangerously leaning over their heads. Experts believed that it would collapse within days. To make things worse, the weather forecast announced that Tropical Storm Elsa would soon hit Florida. Strong winds and heavy rain would further destabilize the building's structure and debris. The rescuers needed to work fast, but the room for optimism was decreasing. The 4th of July was not a merry day in Miami-Dade County. All of the festivities were canceled as the eyes of the entire region looked to the recovery operations at the Champlain Towers South. In an effort to locate more survivors, rescuers brought in thermal cameras and drones. Yet the odds were grim. The death toll rose to 24, and the time was ticking away. On the same day, the authorities announced that the still standing portion of the building would be demolished between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. A company specialized in taking down buildings set up the explosives in the foundation. The storm was coming, and the rescuers were eager to continue the operation before it became too late. A group of residents, however, didn't share their opinion and were worried about the demolition. These were the owners of the pets that were still missing at the time. They gathered 18,000 signatures for their petition to postpone it until all of their pets were found. On July 5th at 10:30 p.m., the western portion of the building was demolished. 20 minutes later, the recovery teams continued their operation. On July 6th, the Elsa storm roared across Florida. Despite the terrible weather conditions, the rescuers opened the entrance to some of the previously inaccessible areas of rubble. Unfortunately, it only allowed them to recover more dead bodies. At the end of the day, the death toll reached 36. Within 24 hours, it increased by 10. At this point, it was evident that 2 weeks after the disaster, finding more survivors would be a true miracle. Therefore, the operation was officially shifted from search and rescue to search and recovery. The efforts lasted until July 26th, when the last victim's body was found. In the end, the death toll reached 98. Only 3 residents survived the collapse. With such a high casualty rate, the Champlain Towers South disaster was one of the worst building catastrophes in U.S. history. As the nation wept over the deaths, they also sought answers as to how such a building could collapse so suddenly. Champlain Towers South was far from low-budget real estate. Condos in the building were listed at $600,000 to $700,000. The exclusive penthouse was sold a couple of months prior to the disaster for just under $3 million. Building amenities included a 24-hour concierge, surveillance system, valet, barbecue area, gym, sauna, hot tub, and a heated outdoor pool. It was hard to believe that such an exclusive building would have structural problems, let alone collapse. But this was precisely the issue with the Champlain Towers South. In October 2018, the engineering firm Morandi Consultants was hired to inspect the building. One of the critical points in the report was the pool deck waterproofing problem. It read, "The waterproofing below the pool deck and entrance drive as well as all of the planter waterproofing is beyond its useful life and therefore must all be completely removed and replaced. The failed waterproofing is causing major structural damage to the concrete structural slab below these areas. Failure to replace the waterproofing in the near future will cause the extent of the concrete deterioration to expand exponentially." The inspection noted cracks in concrete columns, beams, and walls supporting the parking garage under the pool deck. However, even though the report underlined the necessity of repairing the waterproofing to ensure the safety of the residents, it did not indicate the building was at risk of collapse. Morandi never submitted the report to city authorities. The repair would cost around $15 million. It was a hefty price, but a sensible one considering the extent of the work required. The condo association agreed on the proposal and took credit to finance the repairs. The first step in the project was to fix the roof since its structure had also deteriorated. By the time of the collapse, contractors were still working on the job. However, it turned out there were more pressing repairs. 3 days before the disaster, a pool contractor carried out a full inspection to make a bid for its restoration. What he saw beneath the pool deck shocked him. Inside the equipment room, there was water all over the floor. Large cracks in the concrete walls and ceiling exposed rusty rebar. It was an image that caused him grave concern about the condition of the entire pool deck slab. Since 1981, when the building was built, rebar inside the concrete structure holding the pool deck was gradually deteriorating. It was a process that lasted for a full 40 years. Finally, on June 24, 2021, it simply gave in. The collapse of the pool deck slab undermined the base of the central section of the building. A short time later, the central part of the building caved in toward the pool deck. An investigation committee from the National Institute of Standards and Technology has yet to determine the cause of the collapse 1.5 years after the disaster. The investigators state they were examining all aspects that could have contributed to demolishing the condominium, meaning the process could last for years. With Champlain Towers South only a couple of yards away from the beach, the committee also wanted to investigate the effect of salt, humidity, and the other environmental conditions that may have caused the deterioration of the concrete structure. There was also reasonable doubt about the quality of the construction of the building. A forensic engineering expert hired by the town of Surfside to investigate the collapse, Alan E. Kilsheimer, said that rebars inside the concrete beams were not arranged in a way the original project called for. He also expressed doubts about the number of rebars used to reinforce the structure. Given that the building investors were accused of allegedly bribing local officials to get the permit to construct the condominium, the investigators also wanted to get into that aspect. In 2021, all of the people involved in designing, investing, and making the building were already dead. The guilt for the condominium collapse was to be shared by many others. That included the condo association, companies responsible for building and maintaining the building, and the city of Surfside. So on June 23, 2022, a day before the disaster's first anniversary, Miami-Dade Circuit Judge Michael Hansman approved a $1.02 billion tentative settlement between the accused and the victims' families and owners of the demolished condos. The Surfside condominium collapse concerned the residents and the authorities about the condition of other buildings in the town, which could be in a similar state as Champlain Towers South. With this in mind, the state of Florida passed a new condo inspection law that required any residential complex 30 years or older must be inspected for structural integrity and every 10 years thereafter. If the structure is within 3 miles of the coast, the inspection must be done once it reaches 25 years of age and every 10 years thereafter. The law had finally put things in place and assured residents of Surfside and Florida that their properties and lives would be taken care of. Sadly, it was too late for all victims of the Champlain Towers South were forever lost in the ruins of their homes. From Florida to Baltimore, and a threat from a direction nobody expected.
The whole bridge just collapsed.
4 minutes and 17 seconds. The time it takes to listen to Lady Gaga's Just Dance, or for a cup of tea to brew. It's also the amount of time the MV Dolly crew had from the first total blackout to the moment of impact. It's a frantic race against gravity as the 980-foot container ship barrels toward the iconic Francis Scott Key Bridge. And it's a race that ends in tragedy. With the collision caught on a live stream, word of the tragedy spread fast, and so did the questions. Why did the ship hit the bridge? Why did the bridge fail so catastrophically? And who is to blame? In the middle of the night, the MV Dolly departed and began transiting outbound in the Fort McHenry Channel, headed toward the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Less than an hour later, shockwaves moved through Baltimore. The disaster unfolded in under 5 minutes, while the crew and emergency agencies worked frantically to prevent the inevitable. At 1:24 and 32 seconds a.m., the lights first go out on Dolly. The ship is experiencing total power failure, and the propulsion is lost. Multiple alarms ring out. The Voyage Data Recorder, or VDR, often called a ship's black box, stops recording the systems but still captures audio. Onshore footage captures the lights coming back on for the first time. Verbal rudder commands are recorded. The crew is trying to steer the ship away from danger. 9 seconds later, dense black smoke billows out of the funnel. At 1:26, the VDR resumes recording of the ship's systems. Seconds later, the lights go out again. The pilot requests tugboat assistance. It's the first signal of distress. In turn, the Pilot Association's dispatcher contacts the Maryland Transportation Authority's duty officer to report Dolly's lack of steering. The ship is moving at about 8 knots, or 9 miles per hour, and there is no way to change its path. As desperation increases, the pilot commands that the port anchor be dropped. Additional steering commands were also issued, but we don't know what those were yet. 5 seconds later, the lights come on again. Then, just 15 seconds after that, the pilot sends a mayday signal. The vessel is in total blackout and approaching the bridge. It's the second sign of distress. Authorities dispatch units to close the bridge.
I need one of you guys on the south side, one of you guys on the north side, hold all traffic on the Key Bridge. There's a ship approaching, has just lost their steering.
With the last moving vehicle exiting seconds after 1:28 a.m. Less than a minute later, the Dolly strikes one of the bridge's piers. With the anchor dropped, it moves at about 7 knots, but the force of the impact brings the bridge down like a house of cards. The Transportation Authority reports the collapse. Dispatchers were aware of the threat roughly 1.5 minutes before the collision. They managed to warn patrol units to close the bridge to traffic, an action that likely prevented additional casualties. Sadly, 8 construction workers filling potholes were sent plummeting into the icy water about 50 feet below. They would be the first responders' highest priority. With the water in Patapsco at just 48 degrees Fahrenheit, it became a race against time. 2 workers were swiftly rescued, 1 transported to the hospital, and the second declined medical care. By the end of the day, 6 people were still unaccounted for. The biggest question was, why couldn't the Dolly be stopped? The MV Dolly was built by Hyundai Heavy Industries in South Korea in 2015. It was chartered by Maersk and carrying nearly 4,700 shipping containers at the time of the tragedy. On board the ship were its 21 crew members and 2 local pilots. In June 2023, it underwent an inspection, where a minor issue was found and corrected before departure. 3 months later, a U.S. inspection found no problems with the vessel. The initial analysis seems relatively clear-cut. The ship experienced a full blackout, which means that both the engine and electrical power were lost. The electrical power is for the controls and communication systems. The crew never regained engine power. The diesel backup generator kicked in, which was likely what caused the plume of black smoke, but it only restored electrical systems. Maritime expert James Mercante explained that the ship, lacking power and steering, was effectively adrift. Moving at 8 knots, stopping the vessel proved challenging due to its massive size and momentum. Even with anchors deployed, it would require the length of 5 or 6 football fields to halt completely. However, experts also said that the pilots did everything they could and followed the right steps. In fact, the early Mayday call saved lives. The crew has not been identified, but the 2 pilots were local to Baltimore. Foreign-flagged ships must have pilots aboard to guide them in and out of U.S. ports, since they have detailed knowledge of local shipping channels. Pilots are taken to or collected from the vessel by a smaller boat or helicopter while the ship is moving. Once on board, the pilots meet with the captain to advise how to guide the ship out of the harbor. They also give instructions to the crew, but the captain remains in charge and responsible for everything. The pilot doesn't actually steer at all. The first pilot on the Dolly had more than a decade of experience. The second pilot was an apprentice who had reportedly started training last month. Although the National Transportation Safety Board may take months to publish the final report on the cause of the disaster, the urgency of their involvement shows how important it is to find out why the vessel lost power. So, now we know why the Dolly could not stop, but why did the entire bridge fall like a house of cards? The iconic Francis Scott Key Bridge was built in March 1977 for $60 million and named after the poet of the American national anthem. It was praised as a marvel of engineering, with its main span being the 3rd longest of any continuous truss worldwide. A federal inspection in May 2022 gave the bridge a fair rating. Still, it noted concerns about a reinforced concrete column, which had its health index score downgraded. At this point, it's unknown if this was the column that was struck. A structural engineer told news stations that the bridge was up to standard. So, the likely reason for its collapse lies in the design. It was built as a continuous truss bridge without cable supports. The load is distributed to piers that extend beneath the water and into the foundations. Removing one of these piers alters the bridge's structure and doubles the distance to the next support pier. This made the bridge collapse under its own weight. There's also talk about whether hitting a different part of the bridge could have caused less damage. If the ship had hit the bridge's deck instead of the support pillar, the force of the impact might have spread out over a larger area, potentially preventing a complete collapse. But if the bridge was so vulnerable, shouldn't it have been protected in some way? Investigations into the eerily similar Sunshine Skyway Bridge disaster in 1980 found its crash wall, designed to protect the bridge, wasn't big enough to stop the ship. A larger crash wall could have absorbed the ship's impact and possibly redirected it, preventing severe damage. Since then, the focus has been on the design and size of bridge protections to prevent damage during collisions. But these findings came 4 years after the Francis Scott Key Bridge had been built. After that incident, codes changed, and all bridges built after 1991 were required to have increased protection. Therefore, it wasn't a requirement for the Francis Scott Key Bridge, even though the findings strongly recommended it. Another factor to consider is that in the 70s, container ships weren't the same size, so the bridge might not have been designed for such a strong impact. In the immediate aftermath of the collapse, the state of emergency was declared, and $60 million in emergency funds were allocated for debris removal and initial reconstruction efforts. The hopes of finding survivors were dashed. It was now a search and recovery operation. The day after the bridge collapsed, divers found 2 of the victims inside a red pickup truck submerged under approximately 25 feet of water in the middle span of the bridge.
Divers recovered two victims of this tragedy trapped within the vehicle.
Preliminary reports said all 6 of the victims were not from the U.S. a colleague told news stations that the missing men were sitting in their trucks during a break. The underwater discovery came shortly before officials declared it was too hazardous to continue the dive efforts, and they had to turn to removing debris. The cleanup operation is said to involve 3 major steps: removing heavy steel and concrete from the waterway, stabilizing some of the 56 containers with hazardous materials and refloating the ship, and then taking 2,900 feet of the bridge's steel out of the water. As teams work on removing the bridge and reopening the channel, the NTSB's investigation will determine who can be held responsible. Safety experts have meanwhile highlighted that the employer of the 6 killed workers, Bronner Builders, did not provide a mandatory safety skiff. There was also no rescue boat on site, even though it is federally required for overwater projects. Meanwhile, Baltimore City faces 2 major knock-on effects. Firstly, the port is the busiest in the U.S. for handling cars and light trucks. 500,000 passengers and over 10 million tons of general cargo. The backlog has many waiting to get booked at other ports, pushing back their arrival dates for several weeks. Approximately 30,000 vehicles use the bridge daily. Even though diversions are possible, increasing traffic on those routes is inevitable. Plans for rebuilding the bridge and restoring port operations have been set in motion, but experts estimate they could take a year or more to complete. The devastating accident also highlights that many bridges in the U.S. still lack any form of impact protection. Close to 3% are, quote, fracture critical, meaning if one piece of the bridge support fails, the entire structure will collapse. Maryland is in the top 10 states with over 5%. So, one question remains. Nearly 50 years after the Sunshine Skyway tragedy, will this accident drive the federal government to require updated protections for older bridges? The city of Baltimore has vowed not to give up on finding the 4 workers' remains, even though it may take weeks. Much of my research is based on the thorough breakdown by What's Happening in Shipping. I've linked the video in the description. The final collapse raises the most uncomfortable question of all. What if the building was brand new? 1 minute, it's a symbol of progress. The next, a pile of rubble. The collapse of Bangkok's newest skyscraper leaves dozens buried and a nation in shock. But as rescue workers search for survivors, investigations uncover something darker, a conspiracy that could threaten every steel high-rise structure across Thailand. Under the sweltering sun of Bangkok's hot season, workers were building a state-of-the-art complex. The $63 million site included a 33-story skyscraper and conference center in the heart of Bang Sue Commercial District and Transport Hub. The project attracted migrants from poorer regions, with entire families working side by side. But the ambitious plan faced criticism from the outset. One of its contractors, Italian Thai Development, had a tarnished reputation. A year before the construction began, its chairman was convicted of bribing officials. The incidents raised doubts about the company's practices. Yet, its questionable track record was an industry-wide problem. 6 months before the collapse, Thai authorities uncovered a disturbing issue. Several Chinese factories supplied construction sites with substandard steel. The discovery led to a nationwide recall. However, authorities couldn't guarantee all the steel had been confiscated. With tension mounting on all fronts, the build faced more criticism when issues surfaced with its management. Just 3 months before the collapse, an anti-corruption watchdog launched an investigation into the site. It found the project was plagued by worker shortages, which caused it to fall behind schedule. The delays were so severe that the government threatened to cancel its contract. In response, project managers began cutting corners to keep the 2026 deadline. It was a warning sign that shouldn't have been ignored. On March 28th, the tower's already topped out, but only 30% complete. Contractors have at least finished the core structure, so workers are installing its exterior windows. It's an ordinary day with up to 400 staff spread across every level of the building. But midway through the shift, the site begins to tremble. At first, staff thinks it's machinery vibrating the ground. But when they scan the area, a huge crane sways on top of the tower. By the time anyone realizes it, the ground itself is shaking. The structure gives way. People scatter in every direction, running onto the main road to escape the rubble. But a massive dust cloud is hot on their heels. It quickly overtakes them. It spills onto the main road, temporarily blinding everyone in its path. The last thing anyone hears is a deafening crash as the crane falls onto a mountain of concrete. When the dust settles, citizens notice the tower has disappeared from the skyline. It's a devastating blow for the families who moved to the area for work. Fortunately, the building crumbled vertically, so the damage is contained to the construction site. If it had fallen at an angle, it could have flattened the railway lines next door, potentially causing hundreds of fatalities. But it's little to comfort those who couldn't escape in time. One employee described the moment it happened. As concerned relatives try to contact loved ones, their phones light up with a delayed emergency notice. Bangkok had been struck by a 7.7 magnitude earthquake, one of the largest tremors in the city's history. The threat of aftershocks makes the situation even more urgent. The mound of rubble is unstable. Each passing minute reduces the odds of finding survivors. Shortly after the collapse, emergency teams reach the construction site. When the K9 units arrive, they begin locating trapped workers and quickly confirm 3 people have died. By late afternoon, the military arrives to support the rescue operation. Ambulances stream in and out, carrying people away on stretchers. But from the growing crowd of relatives gathered on the street, many are unaccounted for. As the hours pass, families become desperate for news. When an update finally comes in the early evening, it paints a bleak outlook. 81 people are confirmed missing, and the rescue effort has slowed due to aftershocks, making the area unsafe. But something else stands out that no one can explain. Although the tremors shook towers across the city, this is the only high-rise building to collapse. As the revelation spreads online, some notice there's a pattern. The tower's first developer, Italian Thai, is responsible for 2 failed structures. Midway through the government project, a section of the one Bangkok tower crumbled during construction. It was followed by the Rama 2 bridge disaster earlier this year, leaving dozens killed and injured. Commenters also highlight the company is involved in hundreds of projects across Thailand. When the mainstream media reports the connection, it spreads an atmosphere of panic across the nation. What if Thailand's entire infrastructure is a ticking time bomb? By the following morning, the rescue effort reached a critical stage. Survivors were at risk of dehydration due to the stifling heat. The hot weather also made it difficult for emergency crews to locate survivors with thermal imaging equipment. Still, responders detected signs of life from multiple people beneath the rubble, so the fire department deployed heavy machinery to remove debris. When the Prime Minister arrived at midday, at least 78 people were still missing. She announced the Thai government had launched an urgent investigation, which promised answers within 7 days. Given the known issues in the industry, authorities immediately suspected substandard steel was used during the construction. They sent samples from steel beams used in the building for analysis and barred contractors from entering the site. In the meantime, the Chinese government sent an earthquake specialist to investigate the tower's design. After surveying the damage, the engineer confirmed that a new building should have been designed to survive the earthquake. Officials then began to gather evidence from documents at the site. But when they searched the construction office that afternoon, they couldn't locate the tower's blueprints or other key information. At the same time, a local media team was reporting on the incident from the adjacent railway. While filming, they spotted several people carrying files into the rail yard. The group spoke a foreign language and quickly drove off when confronted. The incident was reported to the police, who arrested 4 Chinese nationals the next day. Sources vary, but they were found with at least 32 files from the project, including the missing blueprints. One of the men claimed to be a project manager. According to him, the group took the files to prepare insurance claims despite the ongoing investigation. It was the first sign that someone needed to cover their tracks. Unsurprisingly, news of the misplaced documents sparked allegations of corruption. That was until Thai officials announced they'd analyzed the steel from the site. The results confirmed that some of the materials failed to meet industry strength standards and were prone to breaking under stress. Since the metal beams were branded, it didn't take long to trace their manufacturer. Damningly, the company responsible, Jin Kehwan Steel, was already on the government's radar. Months before the disaster, a fatal fire broke out at its factory, and the inspection that followed uncovered a string of safety violations. The plant used outdated equipment, ignored safety measures, and broke environmental rules, prompting officials to suspend its license. While authorities weighed up the scale of the problem, the human toll mounted. 13 people were confirmed dead, and rescuers were struggling to find survivors. It was the worst news possible for tearful relatives.
ภาวนาขอให้เขารอดแต่พอมาเจอในสภาพอย่างเงี้ยเขาจะอยู่ตรงไหนอ่ะเขาจะอยู่ตรงมุมไหนเขาจะอยู่ชีวิตยังมีชีวิตอยู่ไหมแต่ทุกคนภาวนาขอให้เขามีชีวิตอยู่ทั้ง6 คน
ก็ภาวนาไม่อยากให้แฟนมาที่ตึกนี้ค่ะเพราะเขาทำงาน2 ที่ก็บอกว่าจะมารับพ่อกลับบ้านแต่ไม่ได้บอกเรื่องนี้
In response, international earthquake specialists joined the rescue effort, using 3D modeling to track how the tower fell. But with 75,000 tons of debris, they faced an uphill battle to free victims. As people began to lose hope, engineers discovered critical failures in the site's design. The developers used flat slab construction to build the tower, a technique where each floor or concrete slab rests on vertical columns, like a table balanced on legs. This leads to faster builds at lower cost, as the method requires minimal components. But it results in a frame that's vulnerable to lateral or sideways shaking. If a single column fails, it can cause the entire structure to collapse. Thai building codes require strict testing to ensure high-rise towers can withstand an earthquake. For this reason, contractors typically used reinforced concrete for skyscrapers. In this setup, builders put steel rods inside the concrete to increase its stability. These structures sway during tremors instead of crumbling and are widely used in seismic hotspots. The use of the flat slab method baffled engineers. But when authorities turned their attention to the project's second contractor, they realized it may not have been an innocent mistake. China Railway No. 10 Engineering Group was owned by the Chinese government. Its parent company relied on Chinese infrastructure projects for income, work which had dried up in recent years. This created pressure to secure opportunities abroad, as the developer was $211 billion in debt. According to whistleblowers, the company underpaid subcontractors throughout the build. They in turn used low-quality materials, including columns which were narrower than usual. Practically every aspect of the tower had issues, but a final factor doomed the project. Although the earthquake began in Myanmar, it struck close to the Earth's surface. This sent a powerful surface level or low-frequency waves towards Bangkok, which are most damaging to tall buildings. The city rests on waterlogged ground due to the Chao Phraya River running through it. So when the earthquake struck, it caused the soft soil to wobble like a bowl of jelly, amplifying the forces on structures. The building, never stood a chance. It was clear that the tower's engineering was the cause of the failure, so authorities shifted gears. The case became a criminal investigation into negligence. In the weeks that followed, officials sifted through the confiscated files and began interrogating people of interest. Among them was the site's alleged supervisor. But when he was questioned, the engineer claimed he hadn't worked as a supervisor for 2 decades. If true, it suggests someone had forged his signature for over 5 years. It was another sign of corruption that demonstrated the mammoth task investigators were facing. The probe into the disaster is still ongoing, as the Prime Minister extended its initial deadline. According to reports, it continues to expose malpractice at every turn. Both developers and the faulty steel manufacturer are under investigation. Authorities have promised to hold them accountable. Still, critics argue these companies are only the tip of the iceberg, as it's unclear how regulators responded to the major warning signs. Many also question the safety of Thailand's infrastructure, concerns which have led to nationwide inspections. At the time of this writing, 92 lives have been lost, and 4 are unaccounted for. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing to catch more of our videos.